On today's episode of Locked on Louisville, we are explaining why the Louisville men's basketball team is a top 5 squad in the ACC to start the season.
You are Locked on Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. For those who don't know who I am, this is my third year hosting the Locked On Louisville podcast. I also serve as a credential media member for Cardinal Sports Zone, and I do some PA announcing work for the university in various sports. I want to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder that Locked On Louisville is free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. A recent article came out delivering the way too early ACC basketball power rankings, and the Cardinals landed in the top 4. We're going to explain why they will be a top 5 ACC squad to start the season. We'll also discuss what some reasonable rebuttals would be, why people would be led to believe that they shouldn't be top 5 or aren't top 5. And then we'll conclude the show discussing a late addition to the football team onto the defensive line, Brandon Lane from Stephen F. Austin. So a lot of good stuff to discuss on today's episode of the show. It seems like we are getting closer and closer to the end of the construction of Pat Kelsey's first roster as the head coach of the Louisville Cardinals. As of right now, recording this on Tuesday evening, that last commitment hasn't been announced, but Peyton Siva and Ronnie Hamilton both have released the Pat signals, and it feels like a commitment is imminent. Most would be led to believe that it was going to be Georgia big man Frank Anselem, which we have discussed on the show as probably being the last scholarship addition. But regardless, if it's him or if it's not him, it is probably going to be a guy that will fill the back end of the rotation and play a situational role next season. So it doesn't really affect the discussion that we are having today unless you just get a commitment out of left field and it is a ceiling-raising addition. I just don't foresee that being the case. So if a commitment happens on Tuesday evening, we will likely double up on episodes, but until then, we will continue with our regularly scheduled programming and have an episode on Wednesday. But let's get into the discussion. ACC Power Rankings, it's really early. It's May 21st. And Isaac Trotter, 24/7 Sports staff writer, literally titles his article, Duke UNC headline, way too early ACC basketball power rankings. He has the Cardinals listed or ranked, I should say, at 4th in the early rankings. I think that this is the continuation of a trend where we see Louisville getting a ton of off-season hype and flowers. The great portal class, the great hire of Pat Kelsey, the roster construction, and now it's starting to translate a little bit further into preseason hype. Now, again, some will say, well, you have to see the success on the court. Of course you do. But we're May 21st. That's not going to happen for about 6 months. So we're going to discuss what is being said preseason. Now, I was very interested. This is only one publication, but I was very interested to see where Louisville ends up, how people view this Louisville roster. Let me read to you what Trotter says. He has Louisville 4th behind Duke, North Carolina, and Miami in that order. He says, have an off-season Pat Kelsey. Louisville's facelift is real and wonderful. Louisville's roster is filled with nasty two-way playmakers and skilled shot-making front-court pieces. Hepburn, Hadley, and Edwards should be a terrifying trio of multi-positional defenders who can take turns just nuking opposing perimeter weapons. Edwards and Johnson are electric drivers, and that skill set should be vital for a Louisville roster that has snipers all over the floor like Smith, Waterman, and Pryor. Hepburn should rediscover his jumper too, and Roots, a prize top 35 recruit, adds another big wing who can create off the bounce to Kelsey's deck. Louisville has a little bit of everything except that big-bodied thumper, but look around the ACC. There aren't many options, or there aren't many of those low-post monsters to worry about since Armando Bacot finally graduated and DJ Burns exited after taking NC State to the Final Four. Trotter also ranked Wake Forest to round out the top 5, but Louisville being at 4, I didn't really have a ton of surprise, or it didn't really surprise me a ton, because I do feel like Louisville is a top 5 ACC squad to start the season. And for 3 reasons, in my opinion. Number 1 is the roster that was put together. We discussed having the star power, and Isaac goes over that, but you also have the meaningful depth and the rotation players. You have your go-to likely stars. He mentioned the trio of Chucky Hepburn, Terrence Edwards Jr., and Kason Pryor, 3 very good additions that were decorated veterans at their previous destinations. You have really, really solid rotational pieces, role players like Javon Hadley, Noah Waterman in the front court, also Abubakar Traore. Kenai Roots is an interesting addition to the team, being a top 35 recruit, technically top 10 rated recruit in program history, which is completely being overlooked because of the great roster construction. And maybe you add Frank Anselm into the mix from Georgia. James Scott is projected to be the backup center. And all over, you have a very, very solid front court. Then you look to the backcourt, and sort of the same situation is you have very good starting level players, and then you have some solid depth to go along with that. You have Chucky Hepburn, who started over 100 games in the Big Ten. Corin Johnson was the Pac-12 Sixth Man of the Year, averaged over 11 points per game for Washington in 2023-24, and was arguably the Huskies' best player in the final 2 months of the season down the stretch, and I expect him to take another step forward. Rain Smith knows what Pat Kelsey wants from his team. The leading scorer from Charleston was Kelsey's first commitment as the head coach of the Cardinals. Sharp-shooting guard that can also defend and facilitate for his team. So I like the backup guard play there with Rain Smith. You have multiple guys that have a ton of versatility all over the court. And I know that Ali Khalifa, Kobe Rogers will be redshirting. It's okay. You have 11 serviceable pieces, and multiple players can play multiple positions, like Edwards and Hadley can play the 2 through the 4. I think Hadley's more of a 4 than he is a 2, but Edwards can play the 2 through the 4. Abubakar Traore can play the 3 or the 4. Pryor, the 3 through the 5. Waterman, the 4 and the 5. Hepburn can play on or off ball. Same with Chucky Johnson. Same with Corin Johnson and Rain Smith. And then you have rotational players like James Scott, who I think is going to take the next step forward in his development. And then you also have that last scholarship, who we assume will be Frank Anselm. So your roster is, on paper, definitely top 5, maybe even top 3, I would argue. Number 2, Pat Kelsey. I have high hopes for Pat Kelsey as Louisville's coach. He has won everywhere he's been. He has been a part of Power 5 programs. He recruited really well at Wake Forest. He coached at Xavier, and then he took over as the head coach at Winthrop, took them to the NCAA tournament, took Charleston to the NCAA tournament, and really was able to get that roster to mesh, utilize the transfer portal well, and have a ton of success. So I think that his playing style is going to be directly translatable to the ACC. They're going to play fast on offense. There's going to be an emphasis on perimeter shooting and rebounding the basketball. And now I think that hands down, this will be his most talented, his most versatile on defense, and overall best well-rounded team that he's had, bar none. And it's not even close, nor should it be, with him being a Power 5 head coach now. But I do believe that this coaching staff, now maybe I'm a little bit biased, but truthfully, I think that Pat Kelsey is the right guy for Louisville. I think that, from the people that I've talked to around the industry, there is a lot of high hopes for Kelsey, and they believe he is the right man to right the ship that is the Louisville basketball program. And the third is all up to interpretation. It is uncertainty in the ACC. You look at sort of the surrounding teams. Duke and North Carolina, hands down, I think number 1 and number 2, although Carolina is pretty interesting because they do lose a handful of players, but you bring back Elliot Cadeau and RJ Davis, some other players as well. You're bringing in some transfer guys. Ian Jackson is a very good 5-star level player. Miami is sort of up in the air because you lost Norchad Omier, and you are replacing him with Matt Cleveland, Brandon Johnson, and Lynn Kidd, who I think could be very, very solid front court additions. Overall, unproven. That's sort of the main thing we're talking about is everyone has a new roster. So you have Miami and Louisville. I think Wake Forest is going to be into the mix. Tyler Johnson is on that team now. You've got some younger but very talented players. Clemson brings back Ian Shefflin. Chase Hunter is back. Jaden Zachary transfers in from Boston College. Pittsburgh brings in Damian Dunn from Houston. They had a solid end to the year last season. Virginia is also around that mix. And then Syracuse is on the outside looking in with NC State. Notre Dame, I think, is going to surprise some people. Micah Shrewsbury is a very, very good coach, and I think his team's going to take the next step forward. 7 of its top 8 players are coming back. Nonetheless, what I'm trying to say is that there's a ton of uncertainty across the conference. I think on paper this roster is top 3 in the league, and ultimately I think when you couple that with the uncertainty, and I think Pat Kelsey is going to be a good coach. Louisville is a top 5 team, top 5 ACC squad heading into next season. But let's flip the argument. Why would some not believe that to be the case? Well, we're going to answer that here, coming up here shortly after we tell you about our friends over at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. It's not just another job board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn, because if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Cardinal fans, I've said it once. I've said it multiple times. I will continue to repeat it. If you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV and you have to consistently find yourself turning down the volume with all that shouting, make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, covering your team every day. Louisville has a very good roster. I think that they are one of, if not the biggest winners of the transfer portal this season, or this offseason, I should say. But there are some in this, this is no fault of their own. This is just opinions and analysis. There are some who believe, or who will believe, that Louisville is not a top 5 ACC team to start the season. And I'm going to explain 3 reasons as to why that might be a line of thinking. Number 1, it takes one of my strengths and goes the exact opposite direction. Pat Kelsey has not coached a single minute as a Power 5 head coach. The uncertainty there alone might keep Louisville out of the top 5, at least to start the season, because he's unproven. You might think that it is too rich to put a Pat Kelsey team in the top 5. Number 1, since he has not coached a single Power 5 game yet. And number 2, he has not had a single tournament win to his resume. So I know that Louisville fans are optimistic for Pat as the skipper for this Cardinals team. But others that are not Louisville fans or are indifferent to the conference on the outside looking in might say, yeah, let's pump the brakes here. Let's just wait and see. Let's see what can happen. Let's see what he can do. Can they be top 5 by the end of the season? Of course they can. But are they to start the season? Let's pump the brakes. That's the first reason. I think that's probably one of the more likely reasons. The next one is pertaining to the roster. There are some that will inevitably feel like this roster is not top 5 ACC quality. Whether that is meaningful depth, whether that is pertaining to the starting level guys. Maybe there are some that don't believe that Terrence Edwards, Kason Pryor, and Chucky Hepburn can lead a top 5 ACC team because, after all, this conference has shown in years past, whether it is extremely strong or even if it's having a down season, the league is extremely competitive top to bottom for the most part, right? It's very hard to get, or to finish, I should say, in the top 5. Then again, that's what makes this conversation a little bit more interesting because it's top 5 to start the season. Well, what does that even mean? I ultimately think it's going to be a team that finishes top 5 is sort of the draw there. But some will look at this roster collectively, Kentucky fans, ACC fans, and say, I'm not seeing it. I see a bunch of role players that were good at their previous destinations, but some were mid-major guys that we don't believe are going to play well here. Others played in a very good system that we don't think that skill set's going to translate here. It is what it is. I severely disagree with that take. But one thing that I won't disagree with is the next thing, and part of the roster discussion is that Pat Kelsey's going to have 13 new players. All 13 of these players have not played a single minute for the Louisville Cardinals. Some have not played in the Power 5. A good amount of them have, which I think that helps Louisville out as you do have that veteran experience at this level. But you've got 13 new players. A lot of other schools, yes, they've had to fill needs via the portal, but you've got players that are returning. Like North Carolina has RJ Davis and Elliot Cadeau coming back. You look at what Duke brings to the table. I think they have some returning guys, if I'm not mistaken. Tyrese Proctor and Caleb Foster are back. And then you have a very, very good recruiting class. Miami has Nigel Pack and some other guys returning. Wake Forest, Cam Hildreth, Efton Reed, etc. Chase Hunter and Ian Shefflin for Clemson. Louisville has a complete new team. So there may be some concerns over meshing, those guys playing together as a cohesive unit and getting all 13 players to buy into, the culture, buy into their roles respectively. Again, there is valid hesitancy to believe Louisville is a top 5 or not. It all comes down to projection. Do you think, number one, do you think that this team can mesh well together? Number two, do you think Pat Kelsey can hang in the ACC with the other coaches? 100%, I believe both points. So you have one rebuttal being Kelsey's unproven. Number two is that maybe the roster's not as good as perceived, or just flat out they do not have the cohesive experience together and it is a brand new team. The third is another argument of mine that is flipped in the opposite direction. That is, others view other teams in the ACC to be better. I mean, Isaac Trotter has North Carolina, Duke, and Miami ahead of the Cardinals. I think North Carolina and Duke and North Carolina in that order is probably number 1 and number 2. I wouldn't argue that. But 3 through about 8, you can make the case for a bunch of different teams. And let's say that you believe in Miami, you believe in what Jim Larinaga can do with this team. But let's say you are higher on Wake Forest and Steve Forbes. They have some really solid players coming back. Yes, you lost Andrew Carr, but you have some pretty solid players. Are very talented. It's a deep team. They're explosive. They're athletic. And if Hunter Salas decides to come back to college and back to Winston-Salem, then, yeah, maybe they are a top 5 team for certain. I believe that to be the case. I personally right now have them in the top 5. I also have Clemson above Miami at the current moment, and Clemson has some guys returning. Brad Brownell went to the Elite Eight last season. He's got some players from that team coming back. And if you want to say that they have the returning experience, they've got some big-time transfers like Jaden Zachary from Boston College, who's played in this league. You have Clemson, Miami, and Wake Forest. So you could argue that those three teams by default are better than Louisville. And then not to mention, you go a little bit further down, Pittsburgh has some pieces. They lost some guys, but Jalen Lowe is back. Damian Dunn is very, very good. You have some returning players. And then despite having some new players on the team, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Tony Bennett always seemingly has a team that competes. They have been Louisville's kryptonite. So you have arguably 8 top 5 caliber teams. And if based on preference, you don't have Louisville in the top 5, then I really can't blame you for that. But again, we're discussing what the rebuttals might be. So we'll continue to monitor the landscape of the ACC as we continue throughout the offseason. But as right now, I do believe that Louisville is a top 5 ACC squad. We'll shift gears a little bit towards the football side of things. Louisville seemingly, well, not seemingly, confirmed, had some more roster movement. A late-time addition to the football team, another defensive addition. We'll discuss what Brandon Lane brings to the Cardinals program here coming up momentarily after we tell you about our friends over at Yahoo Finance. Let's get straight to the point. If you want to grow your portfolio to deal with the rising costs of inflation to pay off your debt or your mortgage, I just took on a mortgage back in February. It's been something that I have looked into with Yahoo Finance. Pretty much anything standing in the way of you and your financial freedom, you need to take it up with Yahoo Finance because you can get access to the news, data, and tools that you need in order to help reach that financial freedom. For more than 25 years, Yahoo Finance has been the brand behind every great investor. They are the number one finance destination, producing a look at the financial news cycle, including breaking news, original editorial perspectives, analyst ratings, independent research, customizable charts, and so much more. For comprehensive financial news and analysis, visit the brand behind every great investor, yahoofinance.com. The number one financial destination, yahoofinance.com. That's yahoofinance.com. We're ending out the episode discussing a new commitment for the Louisville football program. That is Stephen F. Austin standout Brandon Lane. He is the most recent addition to the team. The spring portal has been all about addressing depth at the defensive side of the ball, pretty much more specifically in the front seven. You have a linebacker in Dan Foster Jr. that joined from Texas State, and then it's a bunch of defensive line / edge rushers. Miles Jernigan from Cal, Tremel Logan from South Florida, Richard Kinley from Middle Tennessee State, and Renee Conga from Rutgers. Louisville opting to go with more depth, and I think that of the players that have joined, Lane has as good of a chance as any to make an impact right away. I do not believe that the Stephen F. Austin standout will be starting for the Cardinals, and there is no shame in that, but I do think that he is going to play a pivotal role, potentially in the two deep, in the depth conversation. Lane is 6'3", 300 pounds, had a breakout season at the FCS level. This past year started 7 of 11 games, 44 tackles from the interior. 6.5 of those are for a loss, 1.5 sacks, and a fumble recovery to his level of production in the 2023 season. Very interesting past couple months for him. He entered the spring portal on the first day of it opening back in April. He committed to Michigan State fairly quickly and then decommitted. And then there was a ton of Power 5 interest, like a ton of Power 5 interest. You had Michigan in the mix, but it felt like it was going to be a battle between Louisville and Wisconsin. Jody Demling reported that he made it to campus, then he wasn't going to be a part of the class, and then things changed, and then he joined the class. That literally epitomizes how things go in the transfer portal. Things can change in an instant, and they can change back and forth. It really just depends because everything is just so volatile when it comes to portal trends. But the Cardinals add another piece that should be able to help the defensive line right away. I like this move because anytime you can add meaningful depth to the team, it's worth it. And if you have a scholarship open and you feel like this player can help your team, then why not add to the squad? You've lost a handful of guys to the portal, not only throughout the winter, but even in the spring portal alone. You've had multiple guys, most importantly, Tyler Barron, who just committed to Miami on Tuesday, of course. You have multiple players leave. So if you had some scholarships available, you had some players leave like you knew were going to, and you decided to address those needs on the defense, then I'm fine with that. It reminds me of Jeff Brom last offseason, like after the spring game. He decided to completely overhaul the offensive line, and it paid off dividends. It did wonders for the Cardinals last season, especially having dealt with some injuries. You had that meaningful depth. If this is the same trend, but for the defensive line side of the equation, then I'm perfectly fine with that, because at the end of the day, it's all about addressing depth. And if you have the opportunity to take advantage of the transfer portal, then definitely do so. Brandon Lane is likely going to be on the interior for the Cardinals. Again, 6'3", 300 pounds, solid run stopper, underrated pass rusher from the interior. I think he's going to benefit having to play alongside of Thor Griffith. Also in the middle, potentially Des Tell, Ashton Gelati on one side, who's going to be one of the best, if not the best, pass rusher in the ACC. And then some other guys like Adonijah Green, TJ Capers, Miles Jernigan. The list goes on. So I like that the Cardinals are adding depth here. The main thing you do want to know is whether or not a player from the FCS can come over to the Power 5 and have translatable success. Now, it has happened before. We saw it with Tyler Hudson from Central Arkansas. We saw it from Quinterio Cole from Alcorn State. And we could potentially now see it with Brandon Lane. But for every success story, there are a couple players that just didn't really find their footing at the Power 5 level, and that is a very real question as to whether or not that's going to be the case. But ultimately, we won't know until the games are played in the fall. But at this point, I am trusting Jeff Brom fully. If he believes that a player can come in and play a certain role, whether that is a starting role or meaningful depth, then who am I to say that he is incorrect? So I'm interested to see, how much playing time he's going to get. And I'm definitely interested to see who emerges amongst the defensive line in summer practice heading into fall camp, that first game of the season against Austin Peay, especially those first couple of games coming up. So that is going to wrap up today's episode of the show. Again, look, I have no guarantee as to whether or not Louisville will get that final men's basketball commitment while I'm recording or publishing this. If a commitment is coming on Tuesday evening, then I will have another episode on Tuesday evening. If not, we will have a regularly scheduled episode for Wednesday and hopefully discuss that commitment then. But again, we'll see you right back here really soon. Really just depends on how late Pat Kelsey is wanting to cook. We'll see you soon.